Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones is very similar to Rekonoken in terms of mechanics, so if you want more details on that, go watch my review of Fire Emblem. This review is going to be long enough as it is with everything that will be covered, and I prefer not to bring up something that I already tackled in great detail in a previous video. Needless to say, it still contains the same sword conversing, item breaking, permanent bringing, turn-based tactics you'd come to expect from Fire Emblem, though this would subtly blend in many mechanics the series has seen over the years, the most notable of these being an overworld map which first appeared in Fire Emblem Gaiden. Interestingly enough, the arena theme for this game is a cover of the battle motif from Fire Emblem Gaiden. It's a nice nod as to where the game's design most heavily originates. As neat as this edition may be, there's not a whole lot to do on this map. You can visit any of the areas you've already beaten, but the only thing you can do there is buy or sell items. There's lots of land on the map that you never visit, which comes across as a missed opportunity to include side quests, Gaiden chapters, more opportunities to unlock special weapons, possibly even a secret ending or extra characters, or even dive more into the lore of Magwell and the Sacred Stones. Aside from one mandatory one, there are no Gaiden chapters or significant deviations from the main quest outside of the Tower of Alni and Lagdu Ruined, neither of which amount to anything special outside of the post-game creature campaign. After the story splits the two twins, you can enter small skirmishes with any monsters that appear on the map. Yeah, that sounds about right. Skirmishes are very similar to random encounters in a Japanese RPG, featuring the same map scene in a previous chapter, with some minor differences like destroyed buildings or fog of war that pit the player's party against a new horde of foes. The goal in these is always to defeat every enemy, all of which are monsters, another semi-new addition. They technically first appeared in Gaiden, but there's quite a few new creatures that were introduced in Sacred Stones that weren't in that game. They're good for adding more variety to the enemies you fight, but not so much for adding any tension or challenge. Compared to the usual human classes you face, they're pretty easy to deal with. They do tend to have a large amount of HP, but you'll still be able to deal a large amount of damage because of their low defense and resistance. Couple that with a poor hit rate, and these monsters and the skirmishes they partake in amount to nothing more than an exercise in grinding for experience and gold. And sometimes the occasional weapon, but they tend to be fairly rare. Even without partaking in a single skirmish, this is one of the easiest entries to hit Western Shores. Not to say that it's lacking any sort of bite, Sacred Stones is still very challenging. In fact, a very brief montage of all the times a character died when I played Sacred Stones. In terms of difficulty, Sacred Stones is more accessible than the likes of Fire Emblem, mainly because of another big change. Whereas before, promoting unit automatically turned them into a predetermined second class, fighter to warrior, mage to sage, pirate to berserker, etc., Sacred Stone allows the player to choose from one of two different classes when promoting a character, the two main leads being the exception. This is a great addition. It allows the player more flexibility in what their party can do, and the variety in troops that can be created, especially when factoring in the possibility of permadeath and a more limited roster of characters. With the amount of choices and branching class changes comes new units, which we'll go over in a minute. For now, let's talk about some of the smaller changes made to the older units. Generals can now use swords, while Valkyrie can no longer wield anima magic, instead using light magic. Sages can wield both anima and light magic, while druids use dark and anima magic. These tweaks help differentiate between many of the new classes that were introduced in Sacred Stones, giving each character at least two unique classes to choose from when promoting. However, both classes old and new benefited from the return of yet another classic mechanic, the skill system. Sort of. In Fueno Tsurugi and Fire Emblem, there were a few classes that were granted a skill upon promotion, those being the Swordmaster and Berserker in Fueno Tsurugi and the Assassin in Fire Emblem. The Swordmaster and Berserker earned a large boost in their critical hit percentage, while the Assassin, first introduced in Rekonoken, had a small chance to kill an opponent in a single hit, regardless of how much damage an attack would have done. These abilities were given a mention in these games, and despite returning in Sacred Stones, the bonus towards a critical hit for the former two continues to go unmentioned, though the Assassin skill was finally given the name Silencer. Kind of confusing because there's a staff called Silent, and it doesn't silence magic users, but instead kills them instantly. A rather extreme method to silence someone. Like in Rekonoken, it doesn't work on the final boss, but it is a pretty useful ability. Just not a good one for a thief. It's a good change for a more offensive class like a Myrmidon, mainly because the ability is based on your critical hit percentage, and Myrmidon tend to have a higher one than other classes. But for a thief, a class that should not be doing much direct combat due to their frailty and lack of strength, it undermines the niche that they serve in stealing rare items and opening locks in exchange for a luck-based ability that is far too unreliable to be much use in combat. They can still pick locks and open chests if you have a lockpick, but they lose their unique ability to steal. Stealing might seem a bit gimmicky in a game all about tactics, but it actually requires a unique strategy of its own, keeping enemies alive long enough so you can grab whatever goods they're carrying, and keeping away other thieves from any treasure on a map before you can unlock it yourself. There's even a few moments where you can steal certain items from bosses to make battles play out more in your favor. Thankfully, that Breakthrough promotion led to several new classes being introduced, including the Rogue, which preserves the thief's talent for grabbing any loose items off an opponent and grants them the ability to open locks without the need for a pick. Not as combat-centric as the Assassin, but it is a great new unit nonetheless. The other new classes include the Wyvern Knight, a neat option for promoting Pegasus Knight and Wyvern Knight alike thanks to its Pierce ability, which drops an enemy's defense down to 0 before attacking. This is a very useful ability, and it can stack with critical hits for massive damage, but there's one minor problem. Using this class and this ability may cause a glitch that freezes the game. For what it's worth, I've never had this happen to me, but that's mainly because I don't use Wyvern Knight due to the fact that they can only wield lances, while Falcon Knight and Wyvern Lord classes can use swords and lances, and I'd rather not have to spend another hour on a map because the game froze on me. In fairness, you won't activate it if you turn off the animations, so if you do plan on using one, I'd recommend doing that just to be safe. The Mage Knight technically first appeared in Seisen no Keifu, but it doesn't use the same weapons here as it did in that game, then using both swords and magic. In Sacred Stones, they can't wield swords, but they do excel in sorcery, using both anima magic and staves. Basically, they're the Valkyrie from the previous 2 games, just with a shiny new sprite. No ability and weaker than Sages, their saving grace is their high mobility. It's a decent trade-off, though they do lack the utility a Sage provides. On the flip side of weaponry, there's the Grey Knight for Knights and Cavalier alike. They're not as mobile as a Paladin or as well armored as a General, falling somewhere in between the two with the ability to wield swords, lances, and axes. The main problem the class suffers from is taking more damage from special cavalry and armor weaponry, whereas the other promotions, the Paladin and the General, only take damage from one, which kinda defeats the purpose of a mobile unit with more defense. There's also the Shaman's exclusive promotion, the Summoner, which, well, summons things. Phantoms, to be precise, axe-wielding abominations that die in one hit. The strength of a phantom depends on the level of the Summoner, but the HP remains the same. One hit, and they vanish. Even then, what makes more sense? Summon a phantom that can be killed in one hit and do a measly amount of damage, or give your summoner a Nosferatu tomb so they can recover HP while dealing more damage. They're not entirely pointless since you can use them to your advantage as enemies take priority in attacking them over the rest of your party, and they do let you see better during Fog of War encounters, but considering you can only have one phantom on the field per summoner, it is a rather redundant ability. Also, for some reason, the sound when using dark magic is noticeably more quiet than any other class using it. For the record, this is how it should sound. It might have been interesting to see your opponent make use of this class, but this brings us to one of Sacred Stone's biggest problems. Its complete underutilization of the classes it introduces. The Grey Knight makes some seldom appearances, the Mage Knight is used in all of one chapter, while the rest of them, if put on the field at all, the Summoner is never used against you, are situated as stationary boss fights that pose very little challenge. Even in the final few chapters, thieves appear instead of rogues or assassins to loot whatever they can find. It's disappointing that these new classes aren't utilized in the main campaign, because a lot of the later chapters could desperately use some variety in the enemy department. I'd also mention the Ranger class, but honestly, there's nothing to say about it other than that it's this game's replacement for the Nomadic Trooper class from the previous 2 games. No skill, same weaponry, different sprite, and a much worse one in spite of it being made later. Speaking of the older classes, some of them were given skills too. I already mentioned the Assassin Silencer, but the General received the same one it had in Seisen no Keifu. The Great Shield. When activated, the General will take no damage from a given attack. On paper, it sounds great! Until you realize that the General has the highest defense out of any class, so any damage dealt, if any, is trivial. It works for the occasional magical attack, since Generals do tend to have poor resistance, but that's about as far as its usefulness extends. It's certainly not as pointless as the Sniper's Sure Strike, which guarantees an attack will hit with 100% accuracy. Again, sounds great on paper, but the Sniper already has an incredibly high skill rate, thus possessing a high chance of hitting their opponent. Even the description when promoting mentioned how snipers have no equal in their accurate attacks, thus making this ability pointless. The only reliable skill for returning classes is the Bishop Slayer, which triples damage dealt to any monster unit. Considering how many times you encounter them in the game, along with Skirmishes, it is pretty useful, especially when you get to the creature campaign, which I'll talk about in a moment. In addition to these newer roles and special skills for older classes, there's a trio of special classes called Trainees. These classes tend to be fairly weak when introduced, but level up very quickly. When they reach level 10, they can change classes to one of two unpromoted classes, like a Pirate or a Mage, which gives them more options to branch out than any other unit, including a special trainee class once you've beaten the game twice, once on Erica's route and once on Ephraim's. Because of the extra levels and multiple branches, the characters who start off as trainees are three of the most useful units in the entire game. The special trainee promotions, well, not so much. There's the Journeyman, which receives a boost to critical hits, just like the Berserker, which has better caps and strength and most of the other stats. The Berserker, which is an optional class for the Journeyman to change into. Under the special trainee class, a character levels up faster than, say, another promoted unit, sure, but what good is leveling up faster when A, you can grind your heart's content via Skirmishes, and B, most of your stats are the same, if not worse than another class that you can change into, especially when you lose a precious gain to Constitution. Some of you might be wondering what exactly is Constitution, so allow me to elaborate. Essentially, each weapon has a corresponding weight to them, and each character has their own Constitution. The heavier a weapon's weight, the more difficult it will be for characters with a low Constitution to wield, thus lowering their speed when attacking. Likewise, the more Constitution a character has, the easier it will be for them to rescue a character. Unlike every other stat, Constitution does not grow or change upon leveling up. It is only gained by changing classes or very rare items like a body ring. Since the Journeyman features the same growth and the same, if not lower caps for each stat than the Berserker, and does not gain any Constitution, heavier weapons will weigh them down. You do have the option to change to a hero if you try the Journeyman route, but again, you're better off just using one of the other two classes instead of this gimmicky one. Likewise, the special skill for the Recruit is a boost to the critical hit, but doesn't receive a boost to their Constitution. They also can't wield any other weapon unlike every other class they can change into, which makes them a rather useless option considering the lance-wielding Ephraim is a superior unit and a mandatory one for the final chapter. The only worthwhile one of the trainee trio is the Pupil who, after changing to a special class, can wield all branches of offensive magic. No stays, but frankly there's enough characters that can do that in addition to mono or dual magic casting. It's fun to use, but it doesn't justify going through the game 3 times just to try it out. Also, this is a nitpick, but it doesn't actually mention that you can use all kinds of magic when you change classes. But the branch you pass don't just stop with the classes in Sacred Stones, it also extends to the chapters. Bueno Surugi experimented with different chapters based on the player's decisions, but it was rather vague as to how to accomplish this. Sacred Stone takes an approach closer to Reckon Ken in that it's a matter of choosing which road you want to take and who you want to be the main character, which is much less arbitrary than the former, again, making it more straightforward and accessible. Prior to and after the split, there's some rather good map design, including one of the best uses of Fog of War in any game, that being in Chapter 6 with the first encounter against a giant spider. It's rather shocking to see it pop out of the fog since it's an enemy that's never been seen before, but it's also fair, giving you ample time to send a more mobile unit to rescue helpless citizens or protect them by attacking it directly. As for the split chapters, while the two routes do provide a similar amount of variety in terms of objectives, between the two, Ephraim's tend to be less well structured. At the very least, his more aggressive and straightforward missions do fit with his mission to try and prevent the war from dragging on any longer, and do help tell the story through gameplay, but it really does feel like Ephraim's route was tacked on for extra content. Not counting the exclusive chapters, Sacred Stones is one of the shortest games in the series. At 23 chapters, you can beat it in roughly 20 hours, but there isn't a great amount of replayability to be found because of the inclusion of Skirmishes, which makes it much easier to simply fill in every single support conversation. In fact, once you get every single playable character, you can fill in every single support conversation in a little over an hour. While there are 6 exclusive chapters for each of our leads, the rest of the chapters they share feature similar enemies and the same layouts, neither of which justifies a second playthrough, let alone a third to try out the special trainee classes. That is, except for one of them. Chapter 15 changes the location where the player deploys their unit, as well as which units are mandatory. This is a simple, yet brilliant way of presenting the player a new perspective on a familiar map. It shifts the player's goal from a more defensive approach in Erica's, going from one side of the map to the other. The game needed more changes like this. No matter which of the two routes you choose, this map offers a completely different problem with a different solution. The rest of the chapters they share feature similar, if not identical enemies and layouts. We already had this in Fire Emblem, where different tales would yield different opponents on the same map. The difference is that in that game, the different enemies often involved using a different approach in order to achieve victory. In Sacred Stones, the same tactics tend to work just fine for both routes because what few enemies that are changed aren't very different from the ones in the opposite route, further lowering any incentive to replay the game more than twice. There is some post-game content in the form of the Creature campaign, where you can continuously enter skirmishes in areas like the Tower of Elni and Lagdu Ruins. Like the skirmishes, the latter two areas are more useful for grinding out experience and gold, though they are more challenging than the usual skirmish and do allow you to unlock special characters and their respective, often rare weapons. Like the multiplayer mode, it's a harmless addition that adds a small amount of content to a relatively lengthy campaign. Ultimately, all these changes are subtle in that they're very minor in the grand scheme of things. Fire Emblem of the Sacred Stones suffers from the same problem as Advance Wars 2 Black Hole Rising. It's still a great game, but the changes to the gameplay do little to cover up the fact that it is a very iterative entry in the series, one whose design simply does not match up to its predecessor. To bring back that comparison with Gaiden, the amount of changes between it and the first game were staggering. In Fire Emblem Gaiden, the budget classes were more extensive than just 2 options, though it was limited to certain classes. Magic was learned by leveling up and drained your health, and the overworld map was more like a chessboard, with 2 pieces to control and move around at once. The problem with Gaiden is that it went too far in the opposite direction, to the point where most of its additions were abandoned, if not heavily revised, when implemented in future titles. To Sacred Stone's credit, the parts that it borrows from Gaiden are major improvements, but improving something from a game made in 1991 isn't worthy of much praise. Presentation-wise, Sacred Stones look nearly identical to its predecessor. Not that it looks bad, on the contrary. The new units have some of the smoothest animation ever seen on the Game Boy Advance, with some truly mesmerizing sprite work. Just wow. Quite an improvement from what first appeared in Fuendo Tsurugi. While the monster designs are fairly typical, zombies, cyclops, floating eyeballs, they are rendered in a wonderful amount of detail. Having said that, some of the older classes are starting to look a little less impressive given how late this game was released into the Game Boy Advance's life cycle, especially alongside the more fluent and finely detailed ones in Sacred Stones. Considering that it was released a little over a year since the last entry, the improvement is noticeable given that amount of time, but there are quite a few areas where Sacred Stone's presentation is outdone by its predecessor. In Fire Emblem, each of the 3 ladies displayed multiple emotions and even different positions or clothing for their character portrait. This small addition really helped to enhance the tone in every scene they were used, and showed just how the characters felt in a given moment, be it bliss or sadness. In Sacred Stones, every character just squints their eyes whenever they want to show they're sad or tired. It's kind of lazy and a real shame because the portraits are once again excellent, being illustrated by the ever-talented Sachiko Wada. Likewise, the legendary weapons made for the 2 just received a flash, whereas its predecessor gave their 3 leads a trio of terrific and unique animations, at least in North America. They do get a unique theme at the very least. Speaking of the previous title, those cutscenes do make a return for the end credits. It's a little weird since a fair amount of them do show major moments in Sacred Stones. While not as effective as they would be during the actual story, it does work at having you reflect on everything that happened over the course of the game. Still, it would have been better if they scattered them throughout the main campaign instead of relegating them to just the part of the game that no one pays attention to. While many of the sound effects were recycled from the past 2 titles, the music is mostly composed of original tracks with a completely different tone, mainly because it wasn't composed by the same person. Prior to Sacred Stone, the series composer, Yuka Sugiyoko, had quit her full-time job at Intelligent Systems. She was still involved in the score, though her role was less involved, being credited under sound supervisor. Suffice to say, with the different person in charge of composition, the result was a very different sounding score, and a very welcome change at that, going for a more somber tone that perfectly matches the depressing nature of the war the characters have to struggle through. One of the parts that is appreciated is the overworld theme changing to a more gospel-esque motif in the later chapters and what's more before the final one, which fits with the tone seen in the latter half of the story. It's yet another excellent score that's only held back by the horrendous hardware that makes up the Game Boy Advance's sound. It is the highlight of the entire game, the shining star in the skies that make up a very bright tactical RPG. In spite of some harsh criticisms when compared to its predecessor, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones is a superb tactical RPG. It's just that when compared to the game that came before it and the one that came afterwards, it doesn't quite stand up well to the 2 of them. It isn't as challenging or as good as its predecessor, but it is good, just for different reasons. It's a more accessible entry that explores the benefits of giving the player more tools for planning out their tactics and customizing their units, even if some of the tools they're given are more useful than others. While the skill system and world map aren't exactly well done, it did lay a good foundation that led to a much better implementation in later games like Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Fire Emblem Awakening. It's a game that's more interesting based on its potential rather than its execution, but it is still one finely executed tactical RPG. Sales figures are hard to come by, but of what few I found, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones did not sell as well as its predecessor. Until Fire Emblem Awakening, this would be an unfortunate trend for the series, with each new entry selling worse and worse than its predecessor. As for tracking down a physical copy, you could find one on eBay for around $35 to $40. There's also the option to play it on the Nintendo 3DS if you're a part of the Ambassador program, but it is currently not available for sale on that platform. However, both Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones have been released on Virtual Console in North America and Europe for $8. So if you have that option, these two games come highly recommended. Just one more so than the other. If you're looking to get into the Fire Emblem series, this is a pretty good entry to start off with. It got me into the series and, well, here we are today. At this point, I would like to thank you all for joining me in celebrating the Fire Emblem series' 25th anniversary. Here's to 25 more.